It begins with a confession, quiet, almost trembling. At 50, sitting under the pale lights of a studio interview, Kate Moss finally lets the past slip through her lips. No one ever made me feel that alive or that destroyed. For a moment, silence fills the room. The kind of silence that carries 20 years of unshed tears. Behind that sentence lies a memory that refuses to die a night in New York. 1999, when the golden couple of the 90s fell apart for good. They were supposed to be untouchable. Johnny Depp, Hollywood's dark poet, Kate Moss, the face of a generation beautiful, reckless, adored. Together, they were the definition of danger wrapped in velvet. But love, when it burns too fast, always leaves ash. That night at the Mark Hotel, witnesses spoke of shouting, shattered glass, and the echo of police sirens. The tabloids called it the end of rock and roll romance. But for the two of them, it was more than that. It was the sound of something inside collapsing. What no one saw was the quiet after the chaos. Kate sitting barefoot on the floor, cigarette trembling in her hand, Johnny pacing, eyes hollow, already disappearing into the next role, the next escape. They didn't break up because they stopped loving each other. They broke because they couldn't survive the intensity of it. In the years that followed, she would call it a heartbreak that rewired me. He would call it a storm I couldn't control. And yet, even now, when her voice cracks under the weight of memory, there's no bitterness. Only a kind of reverence, the way survivors speak of a fire that nearly killed them. Because theirs wasn't just a breakup. It was an ending that defined them both. A love that burned brighter than fame. A love that became an addiction. A love that left two legends standing in the ruins of themselves. So the question remains, when passion becomes poison, who do you save first, the one you love, or yourself? Before there was destruction, there was beauty, wild, intoxicating beauty. In the mid-1990 seconds, Johnny Depp and Kate Moss were not just lovers, they were the embodiment of everything that made the decade glitter and burn. He was Hollywood's rebel intellectual, the man who turned pain into poetry. She was fashion's enigma, the girl who made imperfection divine. Together, they were the storm everyone wanted to touch. From the moment they met at Café Tabac in New York in 1994, their chemistry was volcanic. The spark was instant, visible even in photographs, the way he looked at her as if she were both muse and mirror. Within weeks, their faces began to appear everywhere, in glossy magazines, backstage at concerts, stepping out of limousines into flashes of paparazzi light. They didn't need to speak. The world already wrote their story, the beautiful outlaw and the impossible girl. Their love became a spectacle of glamour and chaos. The Chateau Marmont, the Viper Room, the Ritz in Paris, every room they entered became an altar to their mythology. Designers dressed them. Artists painted them. Photographers chased them through cigarette smoke and broken dawns. They were dangerous, cinematic, irresistibly flawed. In public, they looked untouchable. He would light her cigarette with trembling devotion. She would lean into him like gravity itself. To the world, they were art, a perfect illusion. But perfection, especially when projected under neon lights, is often just a costume hiding exhaustion. Johnny, already haunted by the ghosts of fame, found in Kate both comfort and chaos. She was younger, fiercely independent, but also fragile in ways that matched his own broken rhythm. They recognized each other's wounds before they spoke of love. That recognition was electric and fatal. Behind the photo shoots and champagne nights were long silences filled with doubt. Kate, still learning who she was beyond the camera, began to drown in the world that adored her. Johnny, oscillating between tenderness and rage, carried the weight of an industry that demanded he remain both mysterious and marketable. Together, they were performing not for cameras, but for survival. Friends would later describe them as addicted to each other's extremes. There were fights that ended in tears, reconciliations that ended in hotel rooms scattered with cigarette butts and half-empty glasses of wine. And yet, every time they fell apart, they found their way back like two magnets drawn by pain. Two outsiders. It all looked intoxicating. The way they held hands on red carpets, the way she wore his shirts in candid photos, the way he whispered to her at premieres as if no one else existed. They weren't just a couple, they were the pulse of the 90s, luxury, rebellion, and heartbreak stitched into one image. But fame is merciless. What began as freedom soon became surveillance. Every argument was photographed. Every bruise turned into a headline. The same flashbulbs that once crowned them now exposed them. For Johnny, the pressure ignited his temper. For Kate, it ignited her fear of abandonment. Still, they tried to protect the illusion. He would write her notes, "You are the only real thing in all this noise." She would slip Polaroids into his jacket pocket before he left for a film shoot. It was tenderness built on quicksand. By 1998, cracks had widened. The passion that once fueled them began to devour what was left. The tabloids sensed the shift whispers of jealousy. Nights spent apart. Broken furniture. Broken hearts. They were no longer the dream, they were the warning. And yet, there were still moments brief, trembling when they remembered why it all began. In some dark hotel corridor, between laughter and tears, they would find each other again. For a second, it was 1994 once more, two lost souls who believed they had found home. But homes built on fire rarely stand. Behind every glossy magazine cover, there was a girl learning that love could be both worship and wound, and a man realizing that devotion could turn into destruction. They didn't see it coming, or maybe they did, and loved each other too much to stop it. The illusion was perfect because they wanted it to be. They needed it to be. For the world, they were the epitome of beauty and desire. For themselves, they were two fragile beings trying to survive their own legend. And as the decade came to an end, so did their illusion, not with betrayal, but with exhaustion. Because even the most beautiful dream, when lived too intensely, must eventually wake up. Love, when it becomes too powerful, turns into something else, a dependency, a mirror where you no longer recognize your own reflection. That was the truth Johnny and Kate refused to see. What the world called passion was, in fact, an ache two wounded souls clinging to each other to stay afloat, only to realize they were both drowning. Behind every glamorous photograph was a different story, mornings that began with silence, nights that ended in tears. Kate would wake up in their London flat, sunlight filtering through cigarette smoke, watching Johnny still asleep beside her, the same man who could make her laugh until she cried, and make her cry until she couldn't breathe. She once said, "Years later, he taught me how to feel everything and how to survive nothing." Johnny, too, carried ghosts. He was a man who had learned to transform pain into art, but not to live with it. On set, he was composed, mysterious, adored. At home, he was restless, searching for the next escape, a drink, a cigarette, a night too loud to remember. Fame had turned him into a myth, and myths are not allowed to be human. Kate, only in her 20s, became the collateral damage of that mythology. The fashion world adored her fragility that thin, almost translucent beauty, the sense that she might vanish if you blinked too long. But off camera, she was a girl who wanted to be held, not photographed. She once followed Johnny from city to city, hoping proximity would keep the distance from growing. But it didn't. It only magnified the loneliness. There were nights when she waited for him to come home, pacing barefoot across hotel carpets, staring at the door as if love could be summoned by will. There were nights when he sat alone on balconies, whiskey in hand, staring into the city lights that no longer comforted him. They were both surrounded by people, stylists, bodyguards, fans, and yet more alone than ever. When they fought, it wasn't about jealousy. It was about fear. Fear of losing what had become their identity. Fear of facing themselves without the others' reflection. Kate's friends remember how she would fall apart after arguments, trembling, hiding in bathrooms. Her mascara smeared like tears she didn't know how to stop. Johnny would show up hours later, guilt heavy in his voice, holding her like a man trying to mend something already cracked. Then they'd make up, and for a brief moment, everything would feel right again too. Right? Almost. The highs were euphoric, the lows unbearable. That is how emotional addiction works. It convinces you that chaos is love. That pain is proof of connection. And in their world, where every feeling was amplified by fame, the addiction was absolute. By 1997, the signs of collapse were everywhere. Johnny had begun filming Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, a performance of madness that mirrored his own unraveling. Kate, meanwhile, was spiraling through parties, her eyes distant, her laughter hollow. In interviews, she smiled like a ghost wearing her own face. In one rare private letter, she wrote, "I keep thinking we could have been happy if the world wasn't watching. But maybe we only existed because it was." That sentence captures their tragedy, love born in the spotlight, dying in its glare. They were never cruel to each other, only lost. Johnny tried to be the protector, Kate tried to be the calm. But both were too broken to save the other. Every apology sounded like déjà vu. Every promise was a prayer whispered too late. After they broke up, the silence was louder than the chaos. Kate disappeared from public view for months, retreating into a solitude that frightened even her closest friends. She later admitted that she cried for years after Johnny left. "I really lost that gauge of somebody I could trust." She said, "There's nobody who's ever been able to take care of me." Johnny did. For a bit. It's a rare kind of grief, the one where the person you love is still alive but no longer yours. You don't mourn their death, you mourn the part of you that died with them. Johnny, meanwhile, dove deeper into work, into characters that let him hide. He played out his pain through fiction, each role a mask, each film a confession disguised as performance. He said little about her in public, only that she was someone who knew him better than he wanted to be known. Years later, when asked about that time, Kate's answer was simple and devastating. "I was young and stupid, and I thought love could fix anything. But it couldn't, because love is not a cure. It's a mirror. And sometimes the reflection is too unbearable to face." In truth, they didn't destroy each other. They revealed each other stripped down to the bone, to the childlike need for safety neither had ever truly known. He, the boy who grew up in chaos, chasing stability he could never hold. She had come back to him, the girl who became an icon before she learned to protect her own heart. Together, they recreated the pain they were both running from. And when the illusion cracked, all that remained was the truth that some loves are meant to transform you, not to last. In one of her later interviews, Kate described seeing Johnny again, briefly. Years after the breakup, it was like seeing a ghost I once loved, she said. We didn't need to talk. Everything that mattered had already been said and felt. That is the cruel beauty of such love. It doesn't end. It lingers, like smoke after a fire, scenting everything that comes after. For Johnny and Kate, the hidden truth was simple yet unbearable. They didn't just fall for each other, they fell into each other. And when you fall that hard, there's no way to land without breaking something essential. Because the most dangerous kind of love isn't the one that fails. It's the one that makes you forget who you were before it began. It happened in the spring of 1999. Inside a hotel suite at the Mark in New York, the night that would end everything. The tabloids later called it a lover's quarrel, as if chaos could be summarized in a headline. But those who were there remember something else entirely: shattered glass, raised voices, a woman crying, a man pacing like a ghost who had already left. Johnny and Kate had fought before jealousy, distance, exhaustion. But this time, the air was different. It wasn't about what had been said, it was about everything that had never been. Years of pressure, fear, and unspoken longing had finally erupted. What began as an argument about trust turned into a desperate struggle for control of the other, of themselves, of a love they could no longer define. When the police arrived, the scene looked like a storm had passed through. No one was hurt, not physically, but the emotional wreckage was absolute. By morning, Johnny was gone. He didn't leave a note. Only a silver bracelet, the one Kate had given him years earlier, engraved with her initials. She found it on the table beside an ashtray full of half-burned cigarettes. It was the only goodbye he could manage. That was the night the illusion died. For the first time, Kate realized that love was not enough, not for a man who was already at war with himself, and not for a woman who mistook chaos for passion. She sat in the corner of that hotel room until dawn, unable to move, unable to cry. Outside, the photographers waited, hungry for an image of destruction. Inside, she quietly began to understand what it meant to lose everything and still have to keep living. In the weeks that followed, she disappeared. The media chased her, eager to capture the fallen goddess. But what they didn't see was the silence that swallowed her whole. She later said, "I lost the only person who could make the world quiet." Johnny, meanwhile, buried himself in work, pretending the story had ended. But even he couldn't erase it. In interviews years later, when someone mentioned her name, a shadow would cross his face, not regret, but recognition. The kind you feel when you know you've seen the truest part of yourself in someone else's eyes. And you let it go. Kate's revelation came slowly, painfully. Over the years that followed, she once described it in a single sentence. "That fall broke me, but it also made me who I am." It wasn't the breakup that defined her, it was what came after. The rebuilding, the silence, the strength to face herself without him. In that absence, she discovered something terrifying and liberating, that she could survive love, even when it nearly killed her. And perhaps that was the tragedy for both of them, that they had to destroy each other to be free. When Johnny later spoke about the relationship, his words were quiet, almost protective. I was difficult to get on with. I let my work get in the way. I never really took the time to show her the calm. It was an apology disguised as reflection, a confession without confession. Their story became legend, the kind of myth that Hollywood feeds on. Beautiful people, broken hearts, the glitter and the blood. But what few understood was how real it had been to them. Behind the myth was something raw and human, two people who loved too much, too soon, and didn't know how to stop. Years later, when asked if she had forgiven him, Kate smiled faintly. "There's nothing to forgive," she said. "He was my teacher. Some lessons just hurt more than others." And that was the real revelation. Not the fight. Not the scandal. Not the end. But the quiet understanding that love, when it burns too brightly, always leaves a shadow behind. In the end, there was no villain. Only two survivors of a love that was too big for the world and perhaps too big for themselves. They didn't just live through a breakup. They lived through a transformation. And when they finally walked away from the wreckage, they carried the same truth in their hearts. That sometimes the most violent ending is also the beginning of who you are meant to become. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of pain, but it never erases it. For Johnny Depp and Kate Moss, the years that followed were quieter, different cities, different loves, different versions of themselves. Yet, in every photograph, in every interview where their names crossed again, there was always the faint trace of something unspoken, gratitude, nostalgia, and the ghost of what they once were. Kate eventually rebuilt herself. She became stronger, wiser, less visible but more real. When she spoke about that time decades later, her words carried no bitterness. "It took me years to learn how to be alone," she said. "But I wouldn't change what we had. It taught me what love costs." Her survival became her redemption, not through forgetting him, but through forgiving the part of herself that had disappeared in him. Johnny, too, changed. Age slowed his chaos. Fame lost its shimmer, and his gaze, once wild and hungry, grew quieter, almost remorseful. In rare moments of reflection, he described Kate not as an ex, but as a memory that still breathes. There was no tragedy in his voice, only acceptance. The fire had burned out, but its warmth remained. Their story is not a warning, nor a fairy tale. It is a mirror for every person who has ever loved too fiercely, too soon, too much. It reminds us that passion is not the same as peace, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to walk away before the fire consumes us. They were never meant to last. They were meant to teach, to show that beauty can coexist with destruction, that tenderness can be born out of chaos, that two people can collide and still leave each other more alive than before. Because in the end, the greatest kind of love isn't the one that saves you, it's the one that changes you. And perhaps that is what remains of them now, scattered across memory and time. A man who learned to face his darkness. A woman who learned to stand in her own light. A love that burned, broke, and somehow still glows.